Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCK playoffs round 1 overview and analysis. Incredibly excited to get this series rocking and rolling. The playoffs are here, the first major playoff series of the year in any of the regions. Of course, we've already had the winter split conclude in the LEC, but this is just a tad bit different. With only 2 splits here in the LCK, these games mean a lot more, and we've got some really intriguing matchups, including a pretty big upset coming into this one, so I'm excited to talk about it in this one. Of course, if you guys are interested as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you haven't checked out the playoff primer that I did for the LCK playoffs, you can get a good idea of not only who I expect to be winning these series that are happening today, but what I think could be happening in some of the future rounds as well. Of course, we'll be going over some of those in this video in that same vein, but if you want to check that video out, it's going to be up in the iCard right now. But without further ado, again, I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. There is a lot to get into in this video, a lot of fun stuff. We're going to be covering both of the round 1 playoff series, so that's 2 series, each of them potentially going 5. We'll kind of talk about, the teams, the expectations, and then eventually what happened. And I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into our first series of the weekend. And our first series of the weekend was actually our higher seed versus our lowest seed. It was the 3-seeded KT Rolster taking on the 6-seeded Liiv SANDBOX. Interesting matchup. KT has dominated this in the regular season, and I talked about that in my playoff preview. They absolutely have to be the favorites going into this. Their consistency has increased dramatically from anything that they were in previous years, and even what they were in the middle of this split towards the back half. And SANDBOX in particular as an opponent has really struggled. They were a team that was exceptional in the beginning part of the year. It really felt like their top side in particular was outperforming pretty much all expectations, but it feels like they have crashed back down to earth. It feels like as the rest of the teams in the LCK kind of caught up, they felt like they were a little bit, they fell a little bit further back down, kind of closer to where I think we all expected them to be. But either way, this playoff matchup was going to be interesting. There are no cakewalks in the LCK. It's the toughest region in the world for a reason, and so it's time to go over what ended up happening in this series. And if you're new here, the format that we do for the playoffs is we go game by game, talking about the advantages, the disadvantages. I want to give you guys a nice little breakdown of everything that happened, and so we're going to be kicking it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 in this series was KT Rolster. They are able to take an early 1-0 series lead. Of course, it's best of 5 all playoffs long in the LCK, so first team to 3 ends up winning the series, and KT jumping out to a nice lead, and they really did dominate this game. You can kind of see that in the stats, 13-5, but 29-minute win, no towers on the side of SANDBOX. This was KT's game to lose, basically from super early on. Really good gank in the early game from Cuz, going out to closer on the Ahri to make sure that he doesn't get any sort of prio in the game, and then it just snowballs out of control from there. They have full control of the map, they have full control of the objectives, and they never really let it go. Like, it's never really up for debate whether or not this team is going to be able to win this one. It's one of the more dominant wins we've seen KT have as of recent. I think a lot of that comes in the draft. You look at a lot of their picks, some unorthodox picks here. I mean, they do kind of fit a lot of the players. In particular, you're looking at the Blitzcrank for Lehens. That's an aggressive pick that he can play early, that plays to his strengths. Keen on the Maokai, or the Malphite rather. He can be really aggressive on that pick in the mid to late game, but he doesn't need a lot of resources in the early game. Malphite is just going to scale incredibly well, especially into Cassante, Lee Sin, Aphelios. That's a really, really valued pick there. And then the most important one here, Xin Zhao coming in the jungle for Cuz. Cuz is actually going to be getting my player of the game in game number 1 here. The early pressure that he was able to exert on this Xin Zhao pick that honestly we're just not seeing other people pick up globally is on it. It's just impressive, right? Cuz is one of those players that I talked about in the pre-series. I talked about basically every lane being in favor of KT Rolster. Top lane's in favor of KT. I talked about that. Mid lane's in favor of KT. I talked about that. Bot lane's in favor of KT. I talked about that. The only lane that I could see being a little bit of an issue for this team is if Cuz in particular has a bad day. Now, that's not to say I think Cuz is a worse player than Willer, but rather I think Cuz can be a little bit up and down, a little bit streaky, a little bit feast or famine. Luckily, at least in game number 1 here, he's able to play this early game powerhouse in the reworked Xin Zhao. He's able to generate that lead early, not only for himself, but for aiming in particular in the bot lane on the Zeri, and then from that point onwards, the game is just out of control. You've got a 6 skill Xin Zhao, jumping on top of your head, really trying to blow you up, and it's a lot easier easier to be able to play the game with that. Vigar has a lot more opportunity. Zeri has a lot more opportunity, not to mention the ridiculous amount of peel you have, potentially with Malphite, potentially with Blitzcrank, even the Xin Zhao jumping on the backline. It's really hard for someone like the Ahri on the other side to actually work out. And so, really good game from Cuz. Him being strong actively pushed this team forward a lot. I thought Keen, BDD, Aiming, Lehens all did their jobs really well, but I think generally KT, generating that early lead is what gave them this win, and they never really looked back. This was pretty akin to a lot of what they were doing towards the back half of the regular season, and that's got to be the biggest sigh of relief that KT fans could possibly give, because this team was genuinely looking like one of the best in the world after the end of the regular season. And then for SANDBOX on the other side in game number 1, certainly not how you wanted to open up the series. Closer was not great in this one. He's going to get my dud of the series. He was first blood on the Ahri, ends up getting ignited, giving that over to BDD. But just generally speaking, who is the Ahri going to actually target on the other side? You can try and target Zeri, but ideally she's never going to be in your range. And you've got a Xin Zhao kind of just doing your job, but better, jumping on top of your Aphelios, jumping on top of your Lee Sin, really creating a lot of difficult opportunities for you to actually be able to play the game. I thought Closer's mechanics in the mid lane being down so much and being out-roamed on the Ahri were disappointing after that early mistake. It just felt like, Liiv SANDBOX made one mistake and they absolutely could not recover. That's not to say anybody else on the team played well. I thought Bertle did nothing in the top lane on the Cassante. Willer got completely out-jungled by Cuz. Envy and Kale really didn't exert any sort of pressure, although I'm willing to give them a little bit of a pass because Aphelios and Thresh do it, at the very least, need a little bit of a team to be able to operate, but generally I was looking for a lot more from the SANDBOX team, and they did feel like they kind of rolled over and died in this game. Not a lot of pushback from them, and so moving on into game 2, I'm really hoping to see SANDBOX at least put up a little bit more of a fight. Even if KT Rolster are the favorites for this series, it should not be a walk in the park. No series in the LCK is really allowed to be a walk in the park, and so SANDBOX is really going to need to step up, and KT just needs to keep their foot on the gas. I really like this idea of early game comps coming out from them. A little bit of late game insurance. Vigar scales incredibly well. Zeri scales incredibly well, but the Xin Zhao, I think, really unlocks a lot of this. That pick, Lee Sin, Elise, those are the things that have really worked for KT to establish dominance early, allow Cuz to generate that lead, and then snowball it into the late game. So are they going to do that again, or is SANDBOX going to be able to take some more control over the early game and transition into the point of the game where they've actually succeeded a lot, which is the mid game? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Liiv SANDBOX. They are able to take that game number 2 and tie things up at 1 apiece. You know me, you know this channel. Game number 2, in my opinion, is the most important game in that best of 5. And for Liiv to be able to take this, it's massive. SANDBOX has really not been in a position to be able to take games off of top teams. Even in best of 3s, they've been 2-0'd a lot by some of the best teams in the region. So to see them at least fight back in this game number 2, yes, the game was relatively close. Yes, it wasn't a complete blowout. But at the very least, they show that they can go toe-to-toe with KT. KT definitely made some mistakes in this game. We'll talk about a couple of players that I think definitely disappointed despite what their scorelines say. But let's start off with SANDBOX. We always start off with the winning team on this channel. Really slow early game, I would say, from both teams, but we get this big fight around Dragon at around, 6 minutes into the game. First Dragon here, and Envy starts going off. He's able to do a ridiculous amount of damage. They're not able to secure the Drake, but they are able to pick up the fight afterwards, and Liiv SANDBOX takes the early lead off of some good team fighting. Now, that's not to say that they were perfect in this one. Some big mid-game mistakes, honestly, coming out from the team. Closer overextended, Willer at times overextended, Bertle in a side lane not having any sort of support. Just things that I wouldn't expect a team in the playoffs to really do, like mistakes that I really wouldn't want to see them have. But I think overall, at the very least, they were able to kind of pull it back. KT got very confident when the gold lead started to get a lot closer, and I think they got a little bit overconfident, because then you saw Keen and BDD and Aiming and Lehens in particular stepping up, being out of position, not really being able to go up against the enemy team, and SANDBOX took advantage of that to kind of reclaim that gold lead. Envy had a ridiculous amount of gold towards the back half of the game and was doing a lot on the Aphelios and Kale. Like, I don't think he missed any of those Thresh hooks. A really impressive game coming out from the SANDBOX bot lane. And that's really where I want to focus my efforts. Kale is going to get my player of the game, but generally speaking, SANDBOX team fought really, really well in this game. There's not one particular player that I want to give a ridiculous amount of praise to, because a lot of them have good moments. Yes, Closer could have hit a few more charms on the Ahri, but Willers engages on the Wukong and his early pressure to make sure that he, kept KT out of the early game. Great. Envy's damage on the Aphelios, ridiculously important, the highest damage dealer in the game. Great. Kale's hooks and his lanterns on Thresh to create plays that just would not be possible if he wasn't nearly as good at the support position. Great. It was a difficult decision to kind of decide my player of the game in this one, but I did want to give it to someone in the bot lane, and it felt like Kale was really the best one. Obviously, I ended up snubbing him, quote-unquote, for my all-pro teams. He was a ridiculously good player in the regular season, but there were 4 ridiculously good supports at the LCK level. I could only choose 3. He was the one to be left out over his contemporary on the other side in Lehens, and maybe he showed this game why he should have been given that nod. Him and Envy really were solid. I'm not super sold on Envy as a player. I still think that he definitely has his own set of flaws, but generally speaking, I thought he was good in this game. He was definitely good at dealing damage, and Willer had a really, really good game. Now, Cuz was not the negative part of the team for KT, but it's good to see Willer be able to step up and have a nice one, even when the enemy jungler is not making mistakes. That was something that I really wanted to see, especially come playoff time, because Willer has been great all year, but mostly it's because he's been capitalizing on a lot of the mistakes, I would say, that other teams are making. It's good to see him be able to generate his own leads and be able to continuously do that in a series like this. So those 3 players definitely. Closer was still good, even if he was missing a ton of charms, and Bertle was solid in the side lane. But overall, this was more of a team effort, I would say, from SANDBOX. As for KT Rolster on the other side of the map here, some good and some bad. Again, you kind of fought your way out of a gold deficit in the beginning of the game. Now, that gold deficit was entirely your fault, but at the very least, you were able to kind of get yourself into a good position. But from that point onwards, you actually did a relatively poor job at being able to capitalize on any of the gold difference that you were able to create. You kind of brought the game even and then got way greedy, especially this bot lane of aiming in Lehens. Blitzcrank hooks were missing 24/7. Zeri was not actually able to deal a lot of damage because she was getting ridiculously poked out at the beginning of the fights because she was just playing way too aggro. It was honestly a pretty disappointing appearance from the KT bot lane. I really had hoped for a lot more from 2 people that I thought really stepped up their game in 2023, both of them obviously having great 2022s, but I wanted to see it be sustainable. It felt like it was in the regular season. This game, maybe not so much. I'm not going to bury them for one game. Obviously, they've got 2 more to kind of pull it out here, but aiming in Lehens, I want to see them be a little bit better. There is no excuse for them losing to Envy and Kale in this series. Lehens is going to get my dead of the game on the Blitz. If you hit just a few more of those hooks on prio targets, maybe this game goes different, but it really did feel like a very stark contrast to game number 1 to see him not have nearly the same kind of impact on red side here in game number 2, and so definitely some things to work on. I still think Keen, Cuz, BDD were relatively fine. Keen had no pressure, and he was getting picked off in side lanes, but for the most part, it's just going to happen when your team is losing. Cuz and BDD actually weren't all that bad. The damage coming out from the Lissandra was okay, but really, when you're looking at this team, this bot lane just needs to be fine, especially going against Envy, who is the weak link of SANDBOX. If KT Rolster's bot lane of aiming in particular can step up and be a huge positive for this team, this series should be an absolute no-brainer for KT Rolster. Unfortunately, this game, that bot lane matchup went in favor of SANDBOX, and that was massive. The series is now tied up at 1-1, and that's big. The next game is super important towards gaining momentum. You do not want to be the team that has to win 2 straight games to survive in the playoffs here. Remember, going out in round 1 means that you do not get the opportunity to play in loser's bracket, and that is a disaster for either one of these teams. And so game 3 definitely going to shift a lot of the momentum, but is KT going to get that momentum back, or is SANDBOX going to shock the world and continue to be up in this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was KT Rolster. They are able to pick up the win in game 3 and bring their series back in their direction. And this was really the dominant performance I think a lot of us were looking for in this series. Obviously, not the game 2 that they in particular were looking for, but it doesn't really matter so long as they do end up taking the series in the end, right? A win is all that counts, and they were able to pick up a win here in this game number 3, setting themselves up for a pretty nice scenario. And honestly, they played great in this game. Liiv SANDBOX, draft-wise, picks a team that really does need some time. I know the Kassadin obviously sticks out, but even something like Cassante Vi as a duo, Xayah in general should be good into Zeri, but she's not going to be able to punish her, especially with the Rakan, in the same way that maybe some of the other bot lanes could. And then the Kassadin absolutely needs time. You're really relying on Willer to be able to generate a lot of your early pressure for you. And unlucky for them, Cuz had another fantastic game in this one. He truly was terrific in the early game. He was able to control a lot of the timing. Liiv SANDBOX in particular did play really slow. They were definitely more content with trading objectives that I think a lot of teams should be in this situation, but I think Cuz did a pretty solid job of being able to kind of push that tempo and push the pace in general, and that's why I'm going to give him my player of the game in this one. That's the second of the series. He's just awesome. He's been playing really, really well for this KT Rolster team, and he, in my opinion, has been by far their most important player through the first 3 games of this series. He's far from the only player that mattered, but I definitely think that his impact in the early and mid game cannot be overshadowed, right? His ability to create plays for the rest of his team, most specifically aiming here, but even Keen in the top lane, who we're going to talk about in just a second, I think was a huge factor as to why KT was able to generate such a large lead in this one. And I think without a jungler like Cuz, it would have been so much more difficult for this team to be able to win. So big ups to him. And then let's talk about Keen in the top lane. I got a ton of comments on my LCK playoff primer video talking about how it was pretty ludicrous that I ranked Bertle over Keen in my All-Pro voting. I do want to clarify that a bit. I talked about this a bit in my LCS video. All-Pro, to me, is not who the better player is. I even said in my KT versus SANDBOX preview that Keen is better than Bertle. I never once questioned that. That was never on my head. I always thought that Keen was the more talented player, but I think Bertle, for my personal criteria, added more wins, and that's what I talked about in the All-Pro sector, is I think that you take Keen off of KT Rolster and maybe the team is still really good. You take Bertle off of SANDBOX, I think that this team does struggle a lot more than what they were able to do in summer. And so I wanted to give Bertle that, kind of nod for his contributions, but never once did I think that Keen was not going to be able to perform well against Bertle in the playoffs. And that's what happened here. He pulled out the Urgot. Correct me if I'm wrong, this might be the first Urgot that we've seen him pro play this split, but either way, it really, really worked in this game. I mean, some incredibly offensive plays that allowed Keen to play really aggressive into something like the Cassante, and he just generated such a large lead. He was such a problem in the late game. If he landed ult on Envy, he was dead, because he could combo him incredibly quickly and then blow up the Xayah without any sort of counterplay to it. And so the Urgot pick absolutely working out. It's really fun to see a good team with a good player be able to pull out something that's a little bit weird, a little bit different, and actually be able to, make it work and make it work incredibly well. But Keen, Cuz, they were definitely the two standouts, but everybody on the team looked good. Again, only one death this entire game, and that was Keen just randomly getting solo killed by Willer, but I'll excuse that. Overall, KT Rolster basically played a near perfect game here, and they deserve all the credit that they are going to get. A fantastic bounce back. Series isn't over, but this certainly puts it in your direction. As for SANDBOX on the other side, definitely not where you wanted to go with this. Coming off of a winning game too, you probably wanted to keep that momentum rolling. You at least wanted to show that you weren't going to be a pushover, but it almost feels like you just ignited the KT fire, and unfortunately, you kind of got burned by that in this game. Pretty much everybody was a candidate for dud of the game, in my opinion, but I'm going to give it to Bertle in the top lane. It felt like Keen absolutely dominated that 1v1 matchup. The Cassante really had no pressure, most notably that Cassante ult towards the back half of the game, where he ults the Urgot right into the backline to blow up the Xayah. It's just it's one of those big feels bad moments. Azir, Cassante, these are some of these champions that can really screw over the enemy team if you don't plan out your moves enough, and unfortunately that was the case for SANDBOX in this one, but Bertle was far from the only player on the team to not do well in this. Willer was really bad in the mid game. He was able to pick up that solo kill on Keen, which was really nice, but outside of that, really no positive plays. Closer had no impact. The Kassadin finally got to level 16 just as the game was ending, and it's like, well, what's the point of this champion? With all the nerfs, he's really not that strong anymore. And then Xayah Leona simply has to win early. There is no excuse for Envy and Kale not winning early here against Aiming in the Hens. I really wanted to see KT Rolster's bot lane bounce back, and they absolutely did in this one. A really good performance coming out from both of them, and a really poor performance coming out from Envy and Kale. This is kind of what I expected going into the split, or going into this series. Aiming in the Hens should have been able to take that, and so honestly, this is more of what I expected for SANDBOX, but their series is not over. They already bounced back after kind of a destructive game number 1. Hopefully they can do it again in game number 3 here, or else their split is going to be completely over. But for KT, they can move on right now, put themselves into the top 4 and put themselves in a really good position, but they're going to have to win game 4 to do it. So are they going to be able to close it out, or is SANDBOX going to be able to fire back and tie things up to send us to a Silver Scrapes game 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are able to do it. They're able to pick up the win in game number 4, and they are able to close out the series. Now, for as great as that is for KT, the fact that they were able to win a playoff series, the fact that they have moved into the top 4, which is obviously so huge in the current format of the LCK because it confirms double elimination. It gives you that extra life that we talked about in that playoff preview video. even with all of that, I still am a little bit concerned about this team because this was not exactly the performance that I think a lot of people were looking for when this team came into playoffs. They were looking so dominant towards the end of the split, especially against teams that they just were able to brute force and out-talent. And there were some major question marks in this game. Honestly, I want to give a relative shout out to Liiv SANDBOX. They obviously, we'll get to it, had their problems in this game, but they were able to get first blood, they were able to get a lot of pressure, and then they were able to win the team fight that ended up happening, after millions and millions of years of passiveness in this game. Unfortunately, they just were too passive. Again, they were too scared. They played like they didn't want to lose. They knew that their comp scaled, but they got to a position where one wrong move was going to end their game, and unfortunately, even though they were stronger, that one wrong move ended up happening. They gave over the soul, and the game was basically over at that point because they lost the team fight. And so, very frustrating stuff coming out from SANDBOX, but good on KT to recognize your win condition, being dragons, being able to secure objectives. If SANDBOX is going to give them over to you for free, you might as well take them, but in most games, you're not going to be in this. This is a game that KT won that in most circumstances, you are just not going to be able to win. My player of the game is going to go to Keen in the top lane. He's had a wonderful series in this one against SANDBOX. Him and Cuz were definitely the two big standouts. They're definitely the two players that you could consider the players of the series. I'll pick one at the end, but Keen's definitely in discussion. He topped the damage charts on Malphite. I know there's been a lot of discussion on internet communities about what his Malphite has been able to offer. I've always been on the side of Keen. I mean, go back and watch my 2019, 2020, 2021, even 2022 coverage of Keen as a player. I've never really been out on him as a player. He has always been someone that I have very much liked, especially recent history might give you a little bit of a alternate history in terms of how that is with, everybody calling out my all-pros this year, but overall, Keen is a player that's always been really high on my radar, and he showed why in this series. It doesn't really matter whether he's getting resources. It doesn't really matter whether he's playing a champion that can typically carry. You put him on whatever, he's going to be able to make a really large impact on the game, and it's just so nice to see him on a team that can actually support him. He got stuck in the Freak system for so long that it's so good to see him. I mean, it's crazy to say it's so good to see him on KT Rolster, considering this org's history, but to see him with players that know how to bring out the best in him, that know how to play around a lot of his advantages, it's just so nice to see. Cuz was also great again in this game. Another Xin Zhao game that he was able to generate a lead on in the early game. This might be a pick that KT continues to go back to. This was a champion that this team played a lot of in 2022, and clearly it's a Cuz staple. This is something they are probably going to bring out a lot in the playoffs, and they were incredibly efficient at it. Keen and Cuz, in my opinion, definitely the two standout members. Aiming, I thought, was fine. Wasn't all that good in game 2, but in their wins, I thought he was good. BDD, a good facilitator. Lehens, I would say, was probably the most questionable part of KT in this series, but for the most part, Lehens is going to have some off days. He's an incredibly aggressive player. Sometimes those plays are going to work. Sometimes they're not, so I'm not going to blame him too much, but KT being able to win this series, being able to secure themselves into the top 4, one of the most important wins they could have had all year long, and even though it didn't exactly look like a KT win, they were able to pull it out in the long run, and that's just got to be a really unlucky way for SANDBOX to end their split. It's not unlucky because it really was their fault, but it's just unfortunate, right? You risk your entire season on a Baron 50-50, and Cuz ends up getting in there to steal it, and all of a sudden you can't win the fight because KT has soul, and you lose the game. Again, very, very slow-paced game, and that was Liiv SANDBOX's doing. They didn't really want to engage in the early parts, which I don't really understand. You've got the Vi, you've got the Lissandra, you've got the Xante. I know you're not exactly killing in terms of damage, but do you really want to risk the entire game on Aphelios getting fed over Zeri? It just feels like a big 50-50. Either way, somehow, because of how KT played, it actually kind of worked. They were able to get that first blood on the Lissandra, and then they moved on in order to, it went 20 minutes with only one kill, and then a massive team fight breaks out, and because SANDBOX has just been farming up, Envy gets a really good ult off. They are able to generate that lead, but again, not pressuring objectives for most of the game, not contesting them really at all in order to avoid fights, really cost them, because that one dragon steal and then all of a sudden that subsequent fight meant the game was instantly over. You set yourself up for a really poor spot in this one, and you have no one to blame but yourselves. It's really a frustrating way for this team's season to end, but I'm not particularly surprised. This is not a team that I think a lot of us were expecting to get out of round 1, and they weren't able to. My dud of the game's going to go to Closer because he really didn't do anything with the early gold that he was able to earn, but give it to Willer, give it to Kale. There were a lot of players on SANDBOX that just didn't have a particularly good game. Kale was missing hooks. Closer wasn't doing anything on the Lissandra in the late game. Willer certainly just got completely out-pressured, and if it's his call to give up every objective, that's incredibly frustrating. There were really not a lot of players on SANDBOX that I can point out being like, yes, good, you looked solid. Obviously, they had a good year, and they outperformed a lot of expectations. I had this team 8th going into my preseason power rankings, but them making playoffs, them making top 6 is obviously great. They just need to be able to confirm that they really are a top 6 team. They did not really play like it in this series, and they didn't play like it towards the end of the year. This is kind of the result I think a lot of us expected. And as for where this team goes in summer, I have no idea. I would imagine you want to run back this comp, but Envy is a major question mark in the bot lane. He certainly didn't show a lot of things. Closer showed that, for all the talk about him improving his champion pool, for all the talk about him becoming a better player in 2023, a lot of the flaws that I had with him and a lot of the reasons I ranked him a lot lower than the general consensus stayed true this split and definitely came out in this playoff series. And, as good as Bertle and Willer have been, they're just not consistent enough to be able to go up against the top teams. I think Liiv SANDBOX is a lot of fun to watch, but unfortunately, their split ends today, and they kind of show their true colors in terms of talent. As for KT, obviously, we'll wait till the end of the video to kind of talk about who they're going to be facing in the final round of the playoffs, or the second round in the playoffs, but even to just advance into the top 4 is absolutely huge. The series should have never been in doubt, and they certainly didn't play all that well to secure their spot in this final game, but at the very least, the win is all that matters, and if you can carry that momentum into a big series in round 2, that's really all you're going to be asking for. And then moving on now to our second series of round 1. We covered KT, we covered Liiv SANDBOX. We know that KT's moving on, but we don't know what the matchups are in round number 2 until we see what matchup happens here at the end of round number 1. This is an incredibly interesting one. It's the 4-seeded Dplus Kia taking on the 5-seeded Hanwha Liiv Esports. A really intriguing matchup between a team that I think a lot of people expected to be a higher seed than number 4 in Dplus Kia and DK. They had a pretty good regular season. They definitely struggled at points, most notably the middle of the split and then the final week of the split. If they don't have these little bumps in the road, this could potentially have been a top 2 seed in the entire league, but I think for the most part, a lot of these players have proven their talent. This team likes to play through their bot lane, but Showmaker in particular has really stepped up in recent weeks, and they're relying on him a lot in order to be the team that I think they really want to be. On the flip side, you've got Hanwha Liiv, who has all the talent and potential in the world. Zeka Viper as a carry lane duo is fantastic. Clid in the jungle has had some great performances over the course of the split. He's also had maybe the single worst jungle performances. It's been the most hot and cold player in the entire league. King and Life, they've definitely been a little bit worse than people expected them to be. Hanwha is definitely one of those teams that people expected to be top tier based on their talent, but it really hasn't come together. But they're certainly not a team you can take lightly, especially in a best of 5 playoff series where the winter season is over. And so I'm excited to go over this. I picked Dplus Kia to take this in, I believe, 4. It could have been 3. It's in the video that you guys can check out that I posted at the beginning here, but let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening, starting off with game number 1. And game number 1 was a Hanwha Liiv win. They are able to take the first game of the series here. A little bit of an upset to kick us off here. Hanwha, not exactly the team that a lot of people were expecting to be able to start the series here with a win. Dplus was pretty heavily favored by basically everybody that was looking at the matchup, and for good reason. But, I was talking about this. Hanwha Liiv certainly has enough talent to be able to compete. And when we were talking about, which direction this series was going to go in my key matchup in the previous video, I highlighted the bot lane matchup. Now, it wasn't always in Hanwha Liiv's favor. In fact, Deft and Kellen were doing really well in the early game in a bot lane that, quite frankly, has to win early. Varus has to be able to get ahead of that Zeri, or else she's just going to permanently outscale you, but you end up getting to the 6 or 7 minute first dragon fight. It's an incredibly slow, incredibly back and forth encounter that Viper is eventually able to just completely break open. He gets a double kill, I believe, in Life. Gets another kill there, and then from that point onwards, the bot lane just snowballs out of control. Some really, really good plays coming out from Hanwha. They were able to generate that lead in that dragon fight, and then from there, they basically never looked back with a comp that scales incredibly well. It is very feast or famine. The Tristana in the mid lane, the Zeri, you do need to make sure that you get gold on these champions, or else they really aren't going to be able to blow up the people that they need to blow up. They're not going to have the time to do it either if Sedge and Gragas aren't playing well, but Hanwha Liiv executed this great. They were finding picks in the mid game. They were really executing in late game team fights. They knew when to go to objectives. This is one of the better performances that Hanwha Liiv has given against a good team all year long, period. End of story. My player of the game obviously goes to Viper. He was awesome on the Zeri, but I think you could realistically give this to Clid as well. Being able to take those objectives. He's a great smiter, as we've known, and he had another really, really good game here. Clid's one of those players that I think obviously, for good reason, has gotten a pretty bad rap over the course of the year so far, but I do want to say that that's kind of ignoring a lot of his good games. He obliterated the bad teams in the league. When this team went up against, teams that they could outskill, teams that they could just out-macro, Clid was dominant. Like, he was unstoppable against those teams. It was really just the difficult games that Clid didn't show up for, but it shows me that Clid is a player that you can rely on when you get to this point in the season, that maybe he's not going to have a great game every game, but, you know, there is a potential for him to be able to break out and control the jungle, control the map, and I think Clid did a really good job of that in this one. Zeka did a good job picking up some kills in the mid to late game. Life's engages on the Rakan were absolutely nutty, and that flank from Kingin in the mid game and bottom river was fantastic. Overall, Hanwha proved basically everything they needed to in game number 1, and now they hold all the cards in their hand. And DK's got to be a little bit scared. This is not exactly how you wanted to start off the series. It's only game 1. You don't need to panic too much. Being able to bounce back and, you know, bring this game to even, bring the series to even is definitely still on the table for you. But the big concern here is the two players that definitely didn't perform are your mid-jungle duo. The two players that I think you're really relying on to step up here in the playoffs being Canyon and Showmaker. Arguably the greatest jungle mid duo of all time here. Canyon's going to get my dud of the game, but it also could go to Showmaker. I thought both were pretty poor in this one. Canyon especially lost jungle pressure early. He had no control over the objectives, over the map. He really had no way to be able to contain, you know, HLE, and Showmaker on that same front just got outshoved by the Tristana, especially after that dragon fight. There really wasn't a lot of proactivity. I feel bad for players like Deft and Kellen who were able to generate their own lead in the early game and then just lost it because their team couldn't control the map. I think overall, DK showed some good things in this one, but it's definitely concerning to be able to lose that first game. They went for a very feast or famine early game comp. You need to be able to generate that lead, or else this team comp is kind of doomed, and they just weren't able to execute on it. I understand why they went for it, because Hanwha Life's early games have not been good, but you gotta be better. You gotta be more aggressive, and you gotta be able to, you know, actively, you know, make those plays in the early game and make them, you know, correct, not just, you know, make random plays in the early game. So overall, definitely some things for DK to fix, but Hanwha Life's gotta be feeling super good coming out of game 1. The series is far from over, though. We've seen plenty of teams be able to come back from an 0-1 deficit. Is DK going to be able to do that, or is Hanwha Life, you know, going to start off this series with a fantastic 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Dplus Kia. They are the second game. They are able to tie the series up at 1 apiece, and this is massive for them. Obviously, they could not afford to go down 0-2 in this series to a team like Hanwha Life. For as many struggles as that team has had over the course of the last few months, there is no way that you want to try and win 3 games in a row against that team. Yes, it is definitely possible for a team like DK, but winning this one makes the series so much more attainable for them. So what ended up happening? What ended up happening here in the series, and why was DK able to end up taking it? Well, they kind of took their strategy from game number 1 and just kind of tripled down on it, which is crazy considering they lost that game at a dragon fight early on, but they go all in on the early game comp. They go Renekton, they go Elise, they go Jace, they go Lucian. They're not able to get the Nami because, you know, R1 Nami on the side of Hanwha to take away that bot lane duo. So they go for the Sona instead, and I honestly think that's not even really that much of a downgrade, if at all. As good as Lucian Nami is as a bot lane, Sona does give you a lot of what you want in that bot lane. Maybe not nearly as synergistic, but she's still going to be incredibly important towards what this team is going to be able to do, and DK did exactly what they were supposed to do. They made some early plays on the map that they desperately needed to make with the comp. Canyon had a really nice dive in the top lane. Kana did a phenomenal job of just playing Kingin out of the game. And then Deft and Kellen really exerted their dominance on the bot side of the map. Really not a lot of complaints. You took an early game team, you played early. Hanwha Life really tried to slow things down. They had a Draven on their side, and so they were just kind of waiting for the opportunity to get Draven that 2k gold or whatever, you know, cash in that he was supposed to get. But look at the scoreline. That's a 0-0 and 0 Draven. He got nothing this game, not even a death. He was never in a position to ever be able to make plays because the team was so scared and so passive around him being, you know, killed in a lot of these fights that they were never actually able to get a lot done. I think overall, good for DK. It's really good, the aggression that they were able to show. My player of the game is definitely going to go to Kana in the top lane. I like Kana. I think he's been a little up and down, mostly up, though, over the course of the season for DK. And I think this game kind of shows why. You can give him a lot of responsibility. This is a player that in the past 4 good teams like T1 has been given responsibility and has been able to do stuff with it. I don't see how DK would ever really be anything different. Renekton as an LCK pick is always something that a lot of these players are going to be willing to pull out in important scenarios. And if you do generate that lead early, like Canyon was able to help facilitate, like, he can be an absolute problem. Obviously, that late game fight in the upper jungle is definitely going to stand out to a lot of people because there is literally no reason Viper should not have gotten a shutdown on the Renekton, but he ends up, you know, drain tanking through everything, a perfect stopwatch. His team comes in and he is able to survive in that fight and not give Draven that shutdown that could have been an avenue for Hanwha Life to really get back in the game, but Kana's expert play kind of, stifled that out. So overall, really good performance coming out of the DK top laner. You got to give a lot of credit to Canyon as well for being able to set that up, but in the mid game, to me, it was a lot of Deft and Kellen, and that's what I really wanted to see. These two have probably been the second most consistent bot lane in the entire region, only behind T1's. And I think Deft in particular has looked incredible on Lucian. Lucian Nami has been a no-brainer for this bot lane to go to over the course of the year. It's good to see that even if they do take away the Nami, they have backup plans, they can play the Sona, and they still like to play in the mid-game power specs. I don't expect this bot lane to go through a lot against DK for the rest of the series, but it's good to see that they can still perform on it. Overall, it's just a good sign to see DK be able to bounce back here. It wasn't Canyon, and it wasn't Showmaker, but it was the rest of the team really stepping up and looking good, and sometimes that's all you need. As for Hanwha, on the other side, not a great game too. You would have liked to see a little bit more aggression come out for this team. I understand that the idea is just to make sure that Viper gets that cash in, because if he does get it, there's actually a pretty good chance you're able to fight in a lot of these, skirmishes in the mid to late game. Unfortunately, resting your entire game on the Draven pick can sometimes be a double-edged sword, because if the enemy team doesn't give up a lot of the pressure in that lane, there really isn't a lot that you can do to force the issue, and that was kind of what happened here. Viper just wasn't able to force the issue. Clid was not engaging, Zeka was not going all the way in, Kingen, when he did go in, it often felt disjointed from the rest of the team, and, when you have that Draven and you don't get that cash out, that champion is going to be incredibly weak, especially compared to these champions that are just, really good base-wise. They may not have the best scaling, but, Draven's not going to either if he doesn't get gold, and so my dud of the game is going to go to Kingen in the top lane. The top diff in this one was pretty noticeable, especially early on. After Kana got that lead from the early Elise gank, he obliterated the top lane matchup. The Cassante was super far behind on the side of HLE, and they really had no tank. Like, they had nobody to be able to deal with the Renekton in the mid game. He's, a great flanker, but, if you've got a Jace, Shock Blast coming in, if you've got Lucian poking you out, sustained with Sona, like, it's going to be very difficult to break through if you don't have that frontline tank to be able to soak up a lot of this poke damage, and Cassante being super far behind was a massive problem. Not to mention the fact that Clid wasn't really diving in, Viper had no damage. Like, this comp was never going to work if Draven didn't get the cash out, and they just didn't invest enough into it in the early and mid game. They didn't take enough risks on the side of Hanwha to be able to get that done. So, credit to DK, they knew their win condition and they played towards it. I don't love this playstyle. Again, I don't know how sustainable it is. I like the idea of playing early against a team like Hanwha that team fights really well, but risking the entire game like you did in this draft on the early game is very, very scary for me. A team that, has had some problems executing in the past. I would really like to believe that DK could be able to do this over the course of 3 more games, but I bet to wager they're going to have to bring something else out now that they've been found out. As for Hanwha, you got to get back to that game 1 form. You put way too much pressure on your AD carry. You need to let the team be the team. And, good for Hanwha, they are a good team. They have more than just their AD carry. I like the idea of Draven, but just make sure you have backup plans. And if you are going to play for that, be more aggressive in the early game. I know this team doesn't have a lot of confidence in what they do early, but you got to at least try. I think overall, that's got to be the analysis you give. So, is Hanwha going to be able to bounce back and take the lead right back from DK, or is DK going to prove that game 1 was a little bit of a fluke? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are able to take game number 3 here and regain control of the series, going up 2-1, putting DK on series point for their entire split and for any chances of going to MSI. This is a team that probably had aspirations of heading to MSI by the end of this split. Well, it could be on the line now as we head into some of the final games, but how did we get there? What ended up happening in game 3? Well, it really should not have gone the way that it went. There is no explanation for why DK played the back half of this game so poorly, but if you watched it, you know what I'm talking about. DK had such a massive lead in this game. I mean, they were genuinely up everything. They had pressure, they had all the objectives, they had all the kills. There was nothing that Hanwha Life had going for them in this game. It would have taken a massive throw from an incredibly fed Zeri in order to, make this game even remotely possible for Hanwha Life, and unlucky for DK fans, that is exactly what happened. Some incredibly unlucky plays coming out from Deft. He did not have the best end to the game here, but let's talk about Hanwha being able to capitalize on a lot of those mistakes. Player of the game for me is going to go to Zeka in the mid lane here on the Yone. Really good game coming out from him. Those ultimates in the back half of fights were incredibly crucial, and his ability to consistently get Deft into bad positions in order to kill him off and really make DK's chances at team fighting a lot worse was incredible this game. Without Zeka playing at this high of a level, Hanwha Life doesn't win even with DK playing as poor as they did towards the back half of this game, and that's just such a good sight. I remember I talked about this in my preview, not only of this game, but of Hanwha Life in general going into playoffs. A lot of people talked about Zeka taking this major step back from Worlds, obviously. He was so good at Worlds, you know, the player of the tournament, not even particularly close. But a lot of people said that his summer split wasn't very good, and people called him a regular season choker. Obviously, I've pushed back on that narrative quite a bit. I thought his regular season in 2022 was very underrated, and I think his regular season this year was also very underrated. He was really, really good for most of the split. Now, he had some bad games here or there, but he's going to do that. He's an incredibly aggressive player that is sometimes going to get caught for his over-aggressiveness, but I think in this game, he's really showing the value that he brings. This isn't some re-emergence overnight. There was a reason I have been hyping this guy up for 4 years now on this channel, and its performances like this. He has shown it. He has shown the ability to do this. It's just really good to see him do it at the highest level. I think at this point, we can safely say that he is one of the clutchest players in the entire world. Unfortunately, not all of his teammates were perfect in this game. I think Viper and Liiv had a pretty poor one. I know that doesn't necessarily reflect in their KDAs, but I think generally speaking, you watch this game, Deft and Kellen dominated them in the bot lane, and they had absolutely no right to. A great gank early on from Canyon to kind of give them that advantage, and then Deft and Kellen end up getting a 2v2 kill onto Viper. It's just not a particularly efficient game coming out from the Lucian. I thought he did fine towards the back half, but this was Zeka playing well. This was Kingan's amazing engages towards the back half on Gnar, and some really good engages by Klid, as well as expert objective management coming out from the jungler. This really was a topside diff, mostly a solo lane diff, in my opinion, from Hanwha, and they've got to be incredibly excited about that. That's not something that you've really been able to say about this team all split long. As for DK on the other side, no one to get dud of the game except for Deft in this one. Just a bad performance in the back half, and it's really frustrating when I have to give someone who actually played really well in the beginning part of the game dud of the game, because it feels like I'm not recognizing what he was able to do. He dominated lane phase on this Zeri. He was given a small lead by Canyon, and then he took that and completely ran with it. Like I said, basically solo killing Viper down in the bot lane in a really nice exchange, being able to get incredibly fed. The problem was he could not stop getting caught in the late game. It was so frustrating. The positioning coming out from him was so disappointing. I was really hoping that those kinds of mistakes he was going to be able to weed out. He really wasn't making them a lot in the regular season, and honestly, it's not something that Deft is necessarily known for. I know I was a little bit lower on him as a player last year compared to a lot of other DRX players, mainly Zeka, right? But, you know, Deft is still one of those players that has incredible upside, and it's been huge for DK. To see him falter in a moment like this that they really needed him to succeed in is incredibly disappointing. Now, it's not to say the rest of the team helped him out. Canyon with some poor engages towards the back half. Showmaker basically did nothing again. That's basically 3 games in a row where he has not been a factor. I thought Kana on the Cassante had some good engages, but he just got blown up too quick. And Kellen was actually alright on the Lulu. I thought he did a decent job trying to keep people alive, but when your main carry, really your only source of damage in the late game, is basically throwing himself away in a lot of these team fights to the Yone, it just gets incredibly difficult to actually win that game. And so, hopefully for DK, now that they are on season point, basically, they are going to be able to step up. This is a team that has no business going out in round 1 with the amount of talent that they have, but they are not performing like a team that is ready to move on to round 2. But for Hanwha Life on the other side, they're looking great. This is arguably the best that they have looked all year long. They've already won this best of 3, quote-unquote, against DK. If they can seal the best of 5 win in game number 4, they are going to prove that they really are going to be coming into some of their potential, and that is massive. So, are they going to be able to close it out in 4, or is DK going to send us to a game number 5 in this really fun series? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are able to get it done here in game number 4. They're able to eliminate Dplus Kia from the playoffs, and they are able to move on to the top 4 in the LCK. Who would have seen this coming? I mean, at the beginning of the year, this could have been a totally reasonable possibility. Hanwha Life over DK, while it was a little bit of a bold take, you know, it wasn't exactly out there. Hanwha Life had upgraded in a lot of positions, and maybe if a lot of these members clicked, if Viper and Zeka and Klid were really having good good seasons, you could see this happening. But going into this series, who saw this one coming? A 4-game series win for HLE, and they absolutely deserved it. A dominant win from them. They did stumble a bit in the mid game here, but at the end, it's really just about who comes out on top, who's, going to be the one to end up destroying the other's nexus, and in that one, it was Hanwha Life. Incredibly good stuff coming out from the team. Player of the game was an absolute no-brainer from me. It's going to go to Zeka in the mid lane on the Yasuo. He's going to get my player of the series. How could I give it to anyone else on Hanwha? He pulls out Windude number 1 in game 3, and he dominates, so they ban it, and then he pulls out Windude number 2 in game number 4, and he's able to dominate even harder, and he's able to completely win this series for the team. Even funnier, obviously, when you see that viral clip of Zeka not knowing how Yasuo works, not knowing that you can hover over somebody to press R and it will ult them and not just ult someone random. Incredibly funny stuff. It seemed like he was legit first timing this champion on stage. And man, did it work out. Any comments about Zeka's small champion pool at this point need to be completely destroyed. He got permabanned in this series. Not even his main champs. Azir, permabanned. Tristana, permabanned. And yet, here we are, him being able to pull out Yasuo. Akali and Sylas weren't even banned. All of this talk about him having a small champion pool, him not being able to perform on a multiple variety of champions, is just wrong. He is an elite level mid laner. There is a reason that he won a Worlds Finals last year. So big credit to Zeka. He was awesome all series, but especially in this game. Want to give a ton of credit to Clid as well. He was very close to getting my player of the game. Zeka obviously taking over in the late game, and so he gets a lot of points for that. But Clid's early game was so dominant. After securing a kill top lane for King, and he immediately goes mid lane to get a kill for Zeka, and then all of a sudden, this game already feels like it's kind of over. The pressure on the top side is simply too much. Clid is having a phenomenal performance. This is the Clid I really wanted to see. I was pushing back on a lot of the narratives that Clid was exclusively bad in the regular season, but even I did not see this series coming. Him completely out-jungling Canyon, arguably the greatest jungler of all time, on the other side of the rift. An unbelievable performance from him. He's definitely in the conversation for player of the series. Kingin was awesome this series, just generally better than Kana, game 2 aside. He was awesome on the Gragas, really setting up a lot of the plays that Zeka wanted to make towards the back half of this game. But even outside of that, just really, really consistent in the top lane. This team could genuinely, I should say, play through him in a lot of these matchups and actually still come out on top. Viper and Liiv were really good in the back half of this game. Not necessarily super impactful in the early part, but Viper, especially in that last team fight around Elder, was super crucial. Overall, this was just HLE being good and being the better team. You've got to give them a lot of credit, because I know I didn't see this coming, and I know a lot of other people did not see this coming. As for DK on the other side, what a disaster. This is the worst finish this organization has ever had in LCK history, which I know sounds like hyperbole, but look at the history. They have never finished below 4th in the LCK since joining in 2019, and here they are finishing 5th in this split. It is about as bad as it could possibly be. Your main components of this team, the historical players on Dplus Kia, were the two that I think showed up the least over the course of the series. Canyon was not good, basically just got out-jungled by Clid in every single game. And then my dud of the game, Showmaker in the mid lane, was invisible the entire series. You can talk about Taliyah not being one of those champions that you carry on, but you still have to be able to perform up to some level here. You have to have some impact. And it felt like the Taliyah was invisible in the early game, was not dealing damage in the late game, and was not really catching people off guard. These are a lot of dashing champions, and yet somehow Taliyah's, Shattered Soil feels completely useless. Very disappointing showing from Showmaker. One of his worst of the year. This felt like early season Showmaker rather than what he had kind of evolved to as the season went on, and that's just about as disappointing as it gets. Obviously, Deft is going to blame himself a bit for how Game 3 ended up going, but, you can't blame yourself too much. At the end of the day, the rest of the team still had a chance to be able to win. Kellen, unfortunately, got Yasuo ulted the entire game, and then Kana was bad this series outside of game number 2, and so DK's got a lot to fix. I don't exactly know where you go. I think it's just confidence with this team. You certainly have the players to be able to win. It's all about just getting them on the right path, but as of now, your spring split is over. You will not be heading to MSI, and you're going to have to regroup in summer. But for HLE, their hopes and dreams are still alive. We'll be talking about some of the matchups that they're going to be facing in round 2, but if Zeka and Viper and Clid and Kingin are all playing at this level, it might not really matter who they're running into. This could be the HLE team that a lot of people were hoping would show up in 2023. But now moving on to some quick series previews here for round 2. Of course, T1 and Gen.G ended up getting buys for being the two best teams in the regular season, the 1 and 2 seeds respectively, and T1 being that number 1 seed, well-deserved, is going to get their choice of which team they want to face in that second round, and they ended up choosing the 3-seeded KT Rolster team. So it's going to be the number 1 seeded T1 taking on 3-seeded KT Rolster. An interesting matchup that I predicted. This was kind of a no-brainer for me. If T1 had the opportunity to pick KT, I felt like they would. I in the video said it was going to be over DK. But even Hanwha Life, first of all, Hanwha Life, the only team to beat T1 in a series this year. But even outside of that, I think Hanwha Life's unpredictableness, like Klid's ability to jump in and out, Zeka's, unbelievable performance when, games actually matter the most. It's just not really something that you really want to go into in a playoff series that is win or go home. But KT Rolster, a team that T1 has historically dominated, and they definitely always feel motivated for the telecom war. And so, how do I think this series is going to go? Well, looking at some of these matchups in particular, obviously, I would be remiss to not say that I think, T1 has the advantage across the board, because of course they do. They had the best player in every single role in the league this year, but I think in particular, some places that I think T1 could really stand out. I think jungle could be a huge advantage. I know people are really high on Cuz, and he had a really good series, but I've never been worried about Cuz's high moments. I've always been worried about his low moments. He's had some really good series in the playoff this year. Hopefully that doesn't stop when he starts playing against a player like Owner. That's really just the hope, is that he can keep up that level of, effectiveness. He has not had a very good split so far against T1 in particular. Owner has definitely gotten the better of him, and that has kind of been a trend over the course of these two careers. Owner almost always does better into Cuz than he does into a lot of other junglers, so that's definitely something to look out for. I think Zeus into Keen is awesome, the two most talented top laners in the LCK. Going head-to-head is a blast. Keria into Lehens, two of the most explosive, supports with, kind of their pet 80 carries and Gumayushi and aiming, but my matchup of the series, kind of a no-brainer in this one for me at least. It's going to be in the mid lane. It's going to be Faker versus BDD. I didn't really have to think too hard about this. These are the two players that I think both of these teams kind of run through. Obviously, Faker had a fantastic year. Outside of Keria, there wasn't a single player in the league that I think was more impactful to his team than Faker. I think you could actually call it one of his best splits of all time. Very similar for BDD, who I think impact-wise on KT Rolster was right up there with almost anybody else on any team in the entire league. He finished third in MVP voting for me. Faker finished second. So this is an incredibly interesting matchup. You can see kind of the difference in stats. Both of them pretty low in damage percentage because their teams are actually pretty good, but BDD first in KP percentage, Faker first in gold difference at 15, it's just kind of a difference in play styles. BDD is going to be willing to sacrifice a lot to help the team out, and he's done that a lot. He's been able to create numbers advantages, be able to create macro advantages for KT Rolster, whereas Faker has gotten himself ahead very consistently. First in GD at 15, but second in damage per minute, third in gold per minute. Really, really impressive stuff just generally coming out from Faker in the mid lane, and if he's going to be able to keep up that level of lane dominance, it's going to be pretty difficult to actually play into him. So I think this mid lane matchup is going to determine a lot. BDD into Faker is almost always a treat. They share a very similar champion pool in general, but overall, I cannot wait for T1KT, a telecom war rivalry in the playoffs. That's going to be an absolute blast to watch. And then moving on to our other series, of course, if KT Rolster was selected by T1, that means the other winner in round 1 is going to be facing the 2-seed. We had the 2-seeded Gen.G taking on the 5-seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Already talked a bit about Hanwha's on fire right now, but Gen.G is a little bit of a different animal. This series is going to be incredibly interesting. Gen.G obviously owned them in the regular season. Hanwha had no trouble losing to some of the best teams in the league incredibly consistently in the regular season, but we've already seen that this is a new look team in the playoffs, and that's hopefully going to show up to this series. I think if you were asking me a week ago, I would have said Gen.G, no question. It's not even up in the air. They destroyed them in the final week of the season, and really it just felt like, across the board, I would say they have the matchup advantage, but Hanwha Life is just one of those teams where if their players actually play up to expectations, if you get Zeka being one of the best mids in the world like he was last year against Chovy at Worlds, if you get Viper playing like the best AD in the world, if you get a good series out of Klid and maybe Peanut's a little bit shaky like he has been known to be, like Hanwha can absolutely take this. I think generally it's all just going to be about Hanwha as a team. You can talk about how, Gen.G is good and Chovy's got some of the best stats in the league, and Pays has actually been phenomenal in the bot lane. Delight's looked good, Peanut's been underrated, Doran's been solid in the top lane, but if Hanwha Life steps up, if they play their game, if they're able to dominate the late game team fights, if they're able to absolutely destroy in terms of mechanical separation, it's going to be very difficult for Gen.G to have a chance. It's crazy. It's mechanical versus mechanical, and honestly, matchup-wise, I would say Hanwha Life isn't really looking bad from a team construction standpoint either, because Gen.G is one of the slowest teams in the entire league. They're one of the teams that like to slow the pace down the most. Pace really takes over a lot in the late game, and they really want to play towards that win condition. Well, Hanwha loves playing towards late game. They're going to thrive if you give them the opportunity to kind of slow down a bit, get Viper and Zeka into a position where they can just play to side lanes or play for team fights in the late game. That's what Hanwha Life wants to do, and so it's not exactly a walk in the park. This is certainly not a matchup that I think that Gen.G will be able to take incredibly comfortably, certainly not as easy as they were able to take it in the regular season. And so that's going to bring us to our key matchup. Again, not going to be a surprise to those of you who watch my channel or watch, this past series that Hanwha Life was in, but my key matchup is going to be in the mid lane between Chovy and Zeka. How can it not be with how Zeka has been performing, not only in the regular season, but also in that playoff series and just his general perception? I mean, this matchup was electric at Worlds last year. Chovy is the single most mechanically dominant player in the entire world. The only player that I think, gives him any sort of run for that. You can talk about Knight and you can talk about Ruler. Those are the only 3 players in the world that I think are on that, unbelievable upper tier level, but I would still take Chovy just in terms of raw mechanics, but he's going into someone who just has that it factor. He plays his style and he consistently is able to generate leads in almost any circumstance in the playoffs. If Zeka is able to generate a lead here, and if Chovy has to play from behind and maybe starts resorting to some of his negative tendencies like he did in that semifinals last year at Worlds, that could be a problem for Gen.G. They might not have a lot of avenues out. Remember, Paze is still a rookie, and Peanut hasn't exactly been perfect in, win or go home series for this team. He's certainly been up and down in the regular season as well, and so if Zeka's able to get the best of Chovy in this matchup, I think there could be some issues, but that is certainly not an easy task. Chovy's not someone that's going to roll over and die. He's certainly not someone that you can beat easily. If Chovy is able to kind of exploit Zeka's weaknesses, which is maybe being a little bit too over-aggressive, maybe make him look a little bit more like regular season Zeka, which was still good, but it wasn't perfect, I think that should tip the scales in favor of Gen.G. And so this mid lane matchup, to me, the most important between these two teams, and it is always a treat to get to see these two play off against each other. All right, that is going to do it for my LCK Spring Playoffs Round 1 overview and analysis. Both series covered, both Round 2 series previewed. Incredibly excited to see how those two end up going. I would be predicting T1 and tentatively Gen.G in these series, but if Hanwha was able to take it, I mean, that is as close as it can come. I would not be surprised at all, but T1 should be able to take care of business. Those are my predictions. Of course, the bracket's up on the screen now. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you guys like about this format? What do you not like about this format? Do you like the graphics? Do you not like the graphics? Do you like the analysis? Do you not like the analysis? I really do love hearing you guys' feedback down in the comment section below on more than just my opinions, also on the video and just how it's constructed. I'd love to hear that from you guys. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting basically one full month in a row, with playoffs just being in every single region. No time for breaks. A video every single day for 33 straight days. We're in the middle of that now, and we're killing it. So I really do appreciate you guys' patience. I know some people complain about not getting certain regions out on time. I don't like double uploading. It's very difficult with a full-time job, as well as, living my life. It's very difficult to do this every single day, multiple times a day, and so one video a day is the best way I could schedule this, and I'm trying to make sure that I get all these videos out in time for the next series. So I appreciate you guys' patience. It really does mean a lot to me, but you guys are great. So, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.